Hey, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, civilly disobedient media. We are in Woonsocket City Hall. Of course, we spend a fair amount of time in Woonsocket, which is truly the Paris of northern Rhode Island. A bit of a contentious city hall, city commission, mayor, Department of Public Works head honcho, city council meeting today. We're here with a longtime friend of the Coalition, John Ward. He is a city council person. Now, what's interesting is in the Woonsocket City Council, everyone's at large. No one represents a particular district. Another conversation, another time, but it has intriguing results. Councilman, what did you think of the meeting tonight?
Well, there were a few surprises. One is that the mayor withdrew her veto of some legislation we wrote, and that was good that she withdrew it so that we wouldn't have to override her veto. But the interesting thing for me was something I had discovered about a week ago, was that the city had advertised for bids to do wetlands restoration, and it intrigued me. So when I looked into it, it occurred to me that it was the site of this wetlands restoration was exactly where the homeless encampment was removed back in December, January, thereabouts, along the river. And at the time, when you were preparing your report and videotape of it, I noticed that they were tearing out trees that were abutting the river. And it intrigued me at the time, and I thought, I don't think you can just willy-nilly remove foliage from the banks of a river without permission from some bureaucratic body.
If I showed up to your house in the middle of the night and took a buzzsaw to your hydrangeas, I'm not sure, are you a hydrangea kind of guy?
No.
No, okay. Took a buzzsaw to your...
Bunch of abrevieties in the backyard.
Okay, that you might take offense.
I would take strong offense.
Right, and I also want to point out, and maybe I get ahead of myself here, the notion that we just replace the plants, that's not quite how wetlands work, is it?
No, you have to be replacing them with very specific list of plants that are going to be provided and determined by Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. Very often, once you remove a plant, they require a plant replacement to actually go back to whatever the indigenous plant was for that space at some time in history.
Right.
It's not a simple process, and so they, I'm sure, will be providing the city with a list of what they have to buy and how they have to place them along the river in order to serve in the best way that the plantings can serve along the banks of a river within the space that's required, from the river's edge up until the distance that's required of it. The other part that intrigued me, and the city's going to have to pay for this in order to do that replacement. The other part that intrigued me was that I noticed the land that the encampment was on actually is state-owned land. When I went to the property records for the city, I was surprised by that. I thought it was city-owned land, but it's not. It's state-owned land, and so I asked the solicitor this evening, simply inquiring, because I think it's a fair question, is what jurisdiction does the city Department of Public Works, Police Department, or General Administration have over homeless people who happen to be living on state land?
Right.
And I'm not sure whether they have jurisdiction at all. I'm not sure that they have the legal right to remove them without the state either requesting or demanding that they be removed from state property. But I don't think any of that was done either. And so I found it interesting that it is that potential problem that they were removed without getting approval from the state first. And it's a little disturbing because that gives you a sense of what may have been and what is thought of as the rush to judgment, just to simply go in there and clear them out and clear the land and make it clear and clean with no consideration of the true full scope of the environment they were walking into.
And your head of your Department of Public Works sort of glossed over the complaint process, and I followed up with him and asked him that. I mean, was it just like, okay, boys be boys, don't you crazy kids, just put the plants back and everything will be fine? We're going to be following up to see if it was quite that simple. I
have a public record request myself in because I was intrigued by this, and I wanted to know from DEM's end what they had sent out to the city, but Their response to me at this point was simply that they provided me a copy of the complaint and that any other documentation would have to wait because it is considered an open investigation. And so I don't know, unless I ask for the communications from the city side, because they're in receipt of those communications, I intend to ask for the city to provide them to the council and to the public, because they're not under the same restrictions of investigation as DEM might be. Maybe we can see more information about what the specifics are, about what they have to do.
Right. Things got a little testy there earlier in the meeting between you and said Department of Public Works honcho. It was odd because I go to a lot of city council meetings. I've never heard someone go off on, I wouldn't call it a rant, but some sort of rant about just what swell folks the administration was, the need to even say that, nor to go off on this tangent about bond financing. And can you just explain to us a little bit of the background? You seem to take particular offense because you have an extensive history of civic engagement in this town. You've been on a number of city councils, and quite frankly, your institutional knowledge of what actually happened, as opposed to sort of the hopes and dreams of some people, is pretty extensive.
Well, I started on the school committee here in Woonsocket in 1995, so I've been hanging around since then. And it was disturbing to me because I don't really object to someone talking about their accomplishments. That's fine. But I think most of the new council people were familiar with the accomplishments of the administration. I don't know how that had to be rehashed, but what was more disturbing about it was simply for the fact that, in talking about the accomplishments over the last 9 years, it somehow had to include some criticism of the past, as though we're smarter than you or we're better than you.
Right.
And that's really not. I don't see that as the way that you really express your pride in what you've accomplished by stepping on someone else's head. And so I took exception to some of the things because, as anybody knows, when you're borrowing money in a city or town, it's circumstantial related to what's taking place at the time. And as I pointed out, a previous public works director was caught in the act of transferring toxic waste from River's Edge, River Island Park, over on one side of the city over to what was then a transfer station on Davison Street. And when he was caught by DEM immediately ordered this transfer station closed, shut down, and now you, as a city, will have to pay to cap this and put some level soil on top of it, put in all the venting, put in all the work necessary to shut this process down. And that costs the city more than $5 million, but they borrowed $5 million in order to complete the process of turning it into the park that it is today. So, that's not a council thing. That's not something that somebody wanted to do necessarily. It's the same with the pension bond. It was in the long term a bad idea because the market took such a severe crash. But had it not, it may have, if it had been a more stable market over time, it may have been something that was feasible. The point is, it was something that was thought of because the city had completely failed. All administrations prior to the Menard administration had completely failed to fund the city pension plan. And they had converted over to the state plan for the new employees starting in the Baldelli administration, but again, failed to fund the local plan at all. By 2002, it was still at 0% funded.
Wow. And
so the idea was, we've got a $90 million obligation, let's fund it up, and then we'll invest it in the market, and we'll be able to carry, like any pension fund would be invested, and we'll carry through to the future. But in the process of doing it, they had to get a bond. It wasn't just about taking money in. So in borrowing it, there were some design features that unfortunately were required at the time by the General Assembly, and it was approved there. And then it was approved overwhelmingly by the voters. So I would really reject the notion of sitting here today, not living at the time in this city, having to make decisions about what direction to take without the information and somehow criticizing it as a bad choice, though it may have turned out to be a bad choice. The fact is that it was not like it was quickly thought up and
There
randomly
was no
thrown out there.
malfeasance here. People were dealing with the best
absolutely not.
information
And the
they
voters
had.
approved every one of them.
Right. There was due process, there was
And then the,
analysis.
you know, we had a deficit reduction bond because the state had cut funding so much that our education system had gone into severe deficits, millions of dollars of deficits. And so the city was on the hook for it, and we couldn't get around it. They simply didn't have the money. So we borrowed money and had to pay it back over 5 years. Well, this administration gained the benefit of the $3 million a year that we were paying when it expired.
Right.
And all of a sudden, there's $3 million in their pocket. So when you can say you can do more for parks, you can do more for roads, you can do more for equipment, you can do more here and more there, and we're great people, you're doing it on the backs of the people who did the hard things to make it possible for you to do that. And so, please, talk about your accomplishments all you want, but do not do it by criticizing those who basically set the table for you in order for you to be able to do it.
There's something to be said for being gracious when it comes to town government.
You would hope so, but
Yeah.
it doesn't. The thought seems to be lost on the Public Works Director. His pride exceeds his decorum.
Last question, and I know it's been a long quote, and again, we're here with Councilman Ward. Thank you again for staying afterwards. You mentioned a veto that
Yes.
just in the minute or two we've got left, just give us a snapshot of that legislation.
The legislation is something I wrote, and I got the almost unanimous support of the council. It's basically that there's opioid settlement funds that are going to be coming into the state. The city has already collected several $100,000 worth of those funds. And so I wrote an ordinance that does nothing more than says the city must comply with the agreements that are the memorandum of agreement with the state over the use of the opioid funds or the settlement determinations of how they can be used, and that the council will be obligated or be the administration in making decisions about how to spend the money must come to the council for an appropriation ordinance to spend the money under whatever plans they bring. But those plans have to be in conformity with the regulations, all of the rules in place. So it's nothing more than to inform the council about what's being done, and so that the council can have input in the discussion and make a decision about doing it in compliance with the law. The mayor's objection was for the fact that there was some fear that somehow there may be something done in violation of the law if the council has jurisdiction over it, but that would imply that the council would want to change up the spending plan that would be not in conformance with the legal requirements, which to me is somewhat of a ridiculous concept. And so I know that there were more than enough votes to override the mayor's veto, and we were about to do that when we were informed that it was being withdrawn, because quite frankly, it would have been overridden anyway. And we did the same thing with CDBG funding and the ARPA funding. I wrote ordinances to do that, give us a participation in the process and approval over the spending. And this was to do the same thing with this fund, establish the fund and have some jurisdiction over it. And before I finish, now that we're done wrapping up, I just need to tell you that we're not so much the Harris of Rhode Island, we're more the Quebec. It's more of a French-Canadian city.
Fair enough.
Not so much as French-Canadian.
Fair enough. Councilman Ward, as always, thank you for your engagement. Be well over the next few weeks. I know you're facing a medical challenge this week. I'm here to help. If you'd like, I'll visit routinely and talk you into sleep.
And as Arnold would say, I'll be back.